We're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution in this unit, and it's rather long because it is complicated. All those changes that we've talked about up into this time period culminate here. So the 1700s to the 1900s is when the Industrial Revolution is at its peak in Europe, and it's going to have all kinds of effects across the world. So it becomes very, very complicated, but I'm going to do my best to kind of explain it in a way that you can understand, hopefully. We'll get through it together. The first thing we need to look at is the characteristics of the colonial system in Latin America. Now, when I say Latin America, I mean everything south of that southern border of America. So you're talking all the islands in the Caribbean, Mexico, and everything in South America. All of that is considered Latin America. So the first thing that we need to talk about is what did colonialism look like there? When the French and mostly the Spanish came to Latin America and took over, what did it look like there? The colonial governments and their economic systems are going to suddenly mirror the governments and economic systems of the country that took them over. So if it's the Spanish that took them over, their government and economy is going to be completely flipped to look like it would look as if they were in Spain. And that's going to cause a huge shift in the Latin American countries. And a major element in the colonial economy was the mining of precious metals for exports. So their exports, you have lots of really a huge array of precious metals all over Latin America, and it's not only going to enslave the people who are going to be forced by the new mother country to work, but it's also going to tear up their land. So you have this kind of disregard for the land from that point on. Catholicism also plays a huge part in the colonial systems because it is a justification for many countries to come to this part of the world from Europe to save the savages, as they put it. So you have these major changes going on in all of the Latin American countries that get caught up in this colonial system, and it leads to massive change in all of them. Now we're going to talk about 5 major cities that developed in colonial Latin America, and if you look at the list here, every single one of them is still a major city in Latin America. So what the Spanish, these were all done, well, not all of them, most of them were done by the Spanish, but those cities are still around today, and if you click to the next slide, you'll be able to see where they are on a map, and again, remember that they still exist and they're still very large cities. So here you can see them. If you can find them all, they're not hard to find. There will be a question on the test about where they're located, so kind of have a general idea and access to the list of these 5 when you take the test. Since we are talking mainly about the fact that the Spanish were the ones that took over, let's kind of look at their system of colonialism and how they set it up. It's a very unique system. There were members of Spanish society called conquistadors who were Spanish explorers, and these explorers went to the crown of Spain and received a charter or government authority to come over here to Latin America and claim a piece of land in the name of the Spanish crown. Spanish crown, not crowned, Spanish crown. I can't talk this morning. So the conquistadors are the one who actually had the legal document. Now once they got over here, a class system began to emerge, and viceroys are going to be at the top. If you were a viceroy, that meant that you were of pure Spanish blood. Both your mother and your father were pure Spanish blood, and you were actually born on Spanish soil, not Spanish colony soil, but actually in Spain. So that's why this class system is very unique. It's not only done through bloodline, it's also done through place of birth. So it's going to be a very rigid class system. You can't change where you were born. You can't change whose descendant you are. So it's set in stone forever. So viceroys are most important at the top of society because they are pure Spanish blood, born in Spain. Creoles are next in line. And a Creole is pure Spanish blood. Mom and dad are both pure Spanish. Mom and dad were both born in Spain, but a Creole was actually born in the Spanish colony. So they're on the middle rung of this rigid class system. Now this already starts a problem, because as viceroy couples were coming to Spain, sometimes the husband would actually send his wife, who was due to have a child, back to Spain, as long as she was in international waters when the baby was born, or actually on Spanish soil. They could count it as a viceroy. But quite often you have this viceroy couple giving birth to a child in a Spanish colony in Latin America, and now that baby is a Creole. So you have two classes living in the same household, and already this creates a problem. Well, eventually, as time went on, you develop another class called mestizo. And a mestizo is a person living in the Spanish colonies that is of mixed blood. So they're born in the Spanish colony, but they have mixed blood in them. They're not pure Spanish. And of course, they're going to be at the bottom rung of this very rigid class system. So again, you could have a viceroy Creole and mestizo all living in the same house together and be related by blood, but they're actually different social classes. They're not supposed to mix with each other. You would never want your Creole child to marry a mestizo. You really didn't even want your viceroy child to marry a Creole, but it's going to happen. So it becomes very confusing. There are tons and tons of other levels as well. I'm only giving you the main three to kind of keep it simple, but you can see why it would be a problem, because it's really hard to stay within your class system and follow the rules of a class system when you could all be within the same household together. So very complicated system. Again, very, very, very rigid. So if you see this on your test, make sure that you can fill in the blanks, who is where. And of course, I didn't include the lowest of all the rigid class systems, and that would be the people at the bottom, who would be the slaves. So they're even lower than the mestizos on this rung. Let's talk about a few people that tried to end this very rigid system of control. Some of them were French, some of them were Spanish, and a couple of them you've already heard. We've already talked about Toussaint Louverture. All you really need to remember for this unit, hopefully you remember that he's the one that freed Haiti, and he's the only, it was the only successful, complete overthrow of slaves against their owners. But Toussaint Louverture, of course, liberated Haiti from the French. Okay. Simon Bolivar liberated northern Latin America from Spain. And then another man that we have not talked about yet was Father Miguel Hidalgo, and he started the Mexican independence movement against Spain as well. So these are just some examples. I just kind of wanted to throw them in there to make sure that you understood that people weren't all just sitting back saying, okay, we'll accept this, we'll let them take us over, and we'll do whatever they say. They were not. All of this invasion by Spanish and French and whoever else decides to come over here is going to have Americans a little bit upset. After the War of 1812 and then the many revolts against European powers in all of Latin America, America herself is really sick of people invading their territory, what they claim to be their territory. And you can see the rapid growth of expansion here in America from this map. We got the idea that this land mass was ours, and we wanted people out of it. And we created something called the Monroe Doctrine in 1828. And basically the doctrine stated that the Americas were closed to colonization. The Americas now, North and South America, closed to colonization, and specifically named the United States as the protector of Latin America. It also recognized the independence of Latin American nations. So we suddenly, in 1828, become the guardian of all of Latin America, and sort of we put ourselves in that situation of Big Brother. You know, if you come to invade Latin America, it's going to mean a war with North America. So we kind of took it upon ourselves to be their babysitter. Now, we're not doing this because we're super sweet. We're doing it because we want that threat of foreign powers along our coastlines to be gone. And if you click to the next slide, you'll see a map of where all these different forces from all over the world were in relation to America. So here you have a map, a moving map, and you can see that different countries have different power here. Of course, there's going to be the British that are going to come and go after the War of 1812. They're finally gone, but they messed with us all the way from 1776 through the War of 1812. You have the Spanish, of course, are in the south. The French are in the north and the Midwest. We also have the Russians who control much of Alaska. So you've got all these different people all around us kind of threatening our borders. And this Monroe Doctrine said, we're not having this anymore. Get out. We're done with it. So we very, very quickly started taking over all of what is now modern America, just to be able to say, this is ours. We're drawing an official boundary line between us and Canada, us and Latin America, and here we are to stay. So you can see how it very, very quickly, this map is going to change over time. And it's just gonna, it's kind of a slow map, but you can see, I do want you to watch it through so you can see how long it took us to get all of our states lined up. There you go. We get the Rio Grande River. Stole it pretty much from Mexico. Still not quite done yet. There's still some other countries. Did you know that Norway was over here for a while? I think people tend to forget that. Another battle over the Rio Grande. And there we go. So again, you can see how many countries were over here on this continent, and we took them all as a threat, that they were threatening our borders. Okay, so now that we have all that in place, colonization, we're still not done talking about that. It's going to come back again and again, but let's get into the Industrial Revolution and how that affected colonization, because they are very much intertwined. The origins of the Industrial Revolution were actually in England. Americans tend to just assume that it happened in America. It did not. It's going to happen in England, and it's because England had natural resources, two very, very important ones, and they were coal and iron ore. So you can see that the population is going to change. You see England on the left-hand side prior to industrialization, and then you can see the concentration of people, how it shifts as industrialization is in full swing with the dark green. So you can see that movement of people out of the countryside just swarming into the cities. So that alone is a huge change during the Industrial Revolution, the shift in population and where the people are. So let's talk about several different inventions and how they changed the world. One of the biggest inventions was created by a man named James Watt, and he is credited with the first working steam engine. And of course, it's a source of power for lots of machines, from railroads to factories to boats. So the steam engine was used in lots of different tools of different trades. Improvement in ship design was a really big deal too, because if the ships were faster through the use of steam, then it wouldn't cost as much to transport your goods. So ship design, not only did you include the steam power, but you also they streamlined the boats and made them lighter, so that also made them faster, and they made the bows of the boat larger and hollowed them out more so that the the boats could carry more. All of this improvement in ship design made it much cheaper to transport your goods and to physically move as an individual. Your ticket on a boat wouldn't be as much. So it increased trade, and it also increased the movement of people from place to place. All-weather roads was a really big deal too. I mean, today we don't think anything of it, but think about it. Before you had roads that actually stayed in place, you had to worry about summer storms and the spring rains and things like that would actually turn the roads to these, a foot thick worth of mud that you couldn't get a horse and buggy across anymore. So in many places all over the world, before there were all-weather roads, there were limited times during the year that you could actually guarantee new goods coming and going in and out of towns, because you had to worry about whether the roads were travel worthy or not. But once you have these all-weather roads, then you don't have to worry about that as much. So that also helped to increase trade and make people lots of money. Now, I'm sure you probably heard of Eli Whitney and the cotton gin. He invented the cotton gin in 1794. And again, remember, that's around that same time period that you have Gabriel Prosser, who is going to do the slave revolt in Virginia and be killed because of it. You have Toussaint and his men in Haiti revolting. And you also have that slave trade that was stopped in America. No new import of slaves in 1808. And all of this culminated into stricter slave codes. They started treating the slaves even worse. But add to this on top of it, slavery was actually dying out. Cotton was not a huge money maker at the time, because it's very hard to process cotton. It's a very lengthy process. Cotton doesn't explode out of its little buds in a garden ready to go and to put on the store shelf. It actually comes out it's very syrupy. It's actually even hard to pick because it sticks to you. So you gather this syrupy cotton stuff into your bag. It takes you all day to fill up just a couple of bags, and the men were usually responsible for that, and then the women were responsible for combing it out. They had to flatten it out, they had to dry the stickiness out of it, and then they had to comb it, because pure cotton has these dark black seeds in it. And if the seeds get wet at all, they explode and turn this pretty white cotton into different shades of ugly gray. So all the seeds had to come out, and the women did this by hand. Now, cotton, whether you know it or not, actually has small shards in it that you can't see. You can't even really feel them when you touch pure cotton, but it actually has these little shards in it that will embed in your skin. So here's these women who are all day combing out this cotton, trying to get the seeds out, and it cuts the tips of their fingers. So now you have to worry about getting the blood out of the cotton. It's just this huge, long process. And Eli Whitney saw the torture of it all and created this cotton gin. And once the syrup is dried out of the cotton, you just put it into this machine and it combed it out for you. The women didn't have to do it anymore. And he felt like it was, it would increase the need for the process of cotton, but it would also help slaves in their day-to-day chores. What he didn't realize is that it was going to have such a huge effect on the production of cotton. Within a few years, cotton becomes what they call king of the South. Everyone is growing it because now it's so easy to process with the invention of the cotton gin, and transportation was really cheap because they charge by the pound. Cotton doesn't weigh anything, so it was a huge money maker. In England, by the 1700s late 1700s, early 1800s, is starting the Industrial Revolution hardcore, and their number one industry is textiles, which means cotton. So Britain was begging America for more cotton. Now it's easy to process. It's very cheap to ship, and again, it becomes king of the South. So the need for slaves quadrupled almost overnight. But you have that issue that in 1808, no more new slaves. So it becomes pretty much a rape fest to get as many babies as fast as possible. They started them in the fields as young as possible. Slaves were treated a million times worse than ever before because you could not afford to lose one slave. And that's when you get to the time era when you have chopping off body parts if a slave tries to run away, and just doing such inhumane things because the masters can't afford to lose any of them. And I know we tend to think of the South as every farmer had this giant plantation and hundreds of slaves. That actually was very rare. Most slave owners only had a small handful of slaves, and they definitely could not afford to lose even one. They needed every hand on board to get the cotton production going and to keep money coming in. So Eli Whitney inadvertently increased this need for slavery and just changed the way that slaves were seen and treated drastically. The Bessemer process for making steel also had a huge effect on pretty much everything that you can think of. The Bessemer process was developed in England, and it's a way to melt steel, so that all you have to do is a create a mold of whatever it is that you want, whether it's a railroad tie or a beam in a building or a horseshoe or whatever it is that you want. You create a mold, you melt down the steel, you pour it in the mold, you let it cool for a little bit, you remove the mold, and voila, you have this perfect thing, whatever it was that you wanted, and then you can reuse the mold again. Very, very, very cheap. Prior to this, you had to hand mold everything, heat up a small piece of it at a time and shape it to the exact shape that you wanted it to be. So the Bessemer process it didn't go by the name Bessemer in England. It was actually, the idea of it was done on a very small scale in England, very, very small. And Henry Bessemer, an American, saw this process in England and created this contraption that you see over here on the left hand side, and that is the Bessemer egg, if you will, and you could now make these monstrous portions of melted steel at a time. So think about how that would change how we make buildings and how much safer they are, and bridges and ships and horseshoes for horses, for that matter. The railroads were highly affected. So everything you can think of that prior to this could not have been made of steel now is. It definitely changes the way that buildings and bridges and infrastructures overall are made across the world, and it makes things a whole lot safer. James Hargreaves came up with something called the spinning jenny, and up until this time period, if you wanted to spin wool or cotton or whatever textile thing that you were working on, you had to do it like this little old lady in the upper hand side with her little spinning wheel. She is making textiles. It was a very, very, very long, drawn out process. But James Hargreaves created the spinning jenny, where what this woman is doing with one thread, this machine can do with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds at a time. And if you see the long bar going across it on that on the left-hand side there, that's called the flying shuttle. And what it did is it wove threads of whatever material you were using, cotton or wool, together, and then the shuttle would come up and kind of slam them together and make very, very tight threads. And it would take a single woman forever to make a giant blanket, where this thing could do, a couple of them in less than an hour. So it changed the face of America. It's also going to remove the need for that little old lady. Sorry, old lady, but progress is on its way. Jethro Tull is the guy who created the seed drill. And the seed drill is basically a machine that you pull behind a horse, and you have different contraptions that you can put on it. The first one is to make, you have to loosen up the soil still, but this contraption that you put on the seed drill would make the perfect rows, and then you would put a different contraption on it and fill it up with seeds, and it would actually poke a hole and fill the hole with a seed as you went along, and it would make these perfect rows. So the perfect rows that you see at the bottom of the screen came about because of the seed drill. Rows before that were not perfect, but now you have a magical way to put the seeds in the ground without doing it by hand, and all the rows are perfectly lined up, and all the seeds are the same space apart, and just a whole new way of planting crops. Saved days and days and days and days, if not months, of manual labor. We also have inventions in science and medicine. Louis Pasteur is actually the guy who came to the understanding that there was a bacteria, something called bacteria, that made people sick. And the way to get rid of that bacteria was through a process called pasteurization, where you heat things up and it gets rid of those germs and that bacteria and keeps people from getting sick. It was actually it had been kind of identified, this idea that there were germs, by people prior to him. He just kind of gave a name to it. There were several doctors that came to realize that in birthing processes, for some reason, the women who were taken care of by doctors in hospitals, and these are mostly the rich women, when they came to deliver their babies, a lot of them died. They got what was called birth bed sickness, and it basically was an infection, and a lot of women who gave birth died because of it. But the women who were using midwives to have their babies delivered very seldom died from this. So of course you have rich women dying and poor women not. So a couple of these doctors got together to try and figure out exactly what it was, and they did figure it out. If you were in a hospital and you had all these women lined up to have babies, and you have a doctor that's doing many different things all at one time, you may deliver a child, go do an autopsy, and from that autopsy go deliver another child, and you have all these people's blood and germs mingling with each other. They of course are not cleaning their hands in between any of it. Think of a car mechanic type thing that goes from one car to the next without cleaning their hands in between. Why would they? They're just going to get messy again. So they came to realize that doctors in hospitals were doing that, going from one human being to another without cleaning in between. But a midwife only had that one baby and woman to have to worry about, and then of course they would clean themselves up before they went to another person's home to deliver another child, so they weren't carrying the germs with them. So it was understood that you needed to start cleaning your hands, but they really didn't understand why until Louis Pasteur gave it a name and called it bacteria and came up with the idea of pasteurization. And he actually did it with wine. Why was certain wines getting bacterias? And he realized that you needed to heat them up and run them through pasteurization before selling them. So it actually was wine, but he put it together with medical knowledge as well and changed the medical world. Edward Jenner, we've already talked about. He's the smallpox vaccine guy, and his vaccine led to many other types of vaccines. So you got to throw him in there with the inventions of this time period, just because he was part of it, and his ideas spread the ideas of many others as far as preventative medicine. One more time, I want to take a moment to remind you that the Industrial Revolution actually started in Europe and then spread to the United States, not the other way around. People tend to forget that. Now, impacts of the Industrial Revolution were good and bad. You can see from the pictures here, it did improve transportation. We have safer trains, safer boats, cheaper for trade. Cars are going to come out of it, but it's also going to cause lots of environmental pollution. So those are two of the big impacts of Industrial Revolution on a broad scale. But we're also going to get into what happens to families because of the Industrial Revolution and to individuals. Now, we talked about that poor little old lady with the spinning wheel and how she's going to kind of become obsolete with James Hargreaves' invention of the spinning jenny. So let's kind of take a detailed look at what exactly does happen to this lady and all the other people like her. Prior to industrialization, we had something called cottage industries. And cottage industries were basically like that little old lady that I showed you doing the spinning wheel. She and others like her were the ones that spun the threads to create textiles, or created them, spun the thread and created them, and people paid them. It was very slow. It was very, very costly. And these cottage industries were run by people who basically were renting land from large landowners. But eventually the landowners realized that there was this huge call for wool, and it would be so much more convenient and so much less problems if they kicked all those nasty people off of their property, fenced it in, and just raised sheep for their wool. And then they could shear the sheep and sell the wool to the textile companies that were popping up all over Europe. So they would make a lot more money off of it, and again, you didn't have to worry with tenants and are they paying their rent, or are they tearing the property up, that kind of stuff. So this became called the enclosure movement because people literally enclosed their land. They put fences up and kicked the peasant farmers off the land. So the enclosure movement basically destroyed cottage industries. So what's going to replace those cottage industries? Of course, it's going to be factories. So people in the cottage industries, they're kicked off the land through the enclosure movement. They have nowhere to go but the cities. And suddenly you have this massive migration into the cities, which is called urbanization. So urbanization, again, that massive movement of people kicked off their land through the enclosure movement and moving into the cities in large quantities. More impacts of the Industrial Revolution on a wide scale and a small scale. We have urbanization, which we just talked about. You're going to have this dissatisfaction very quickly of the working class people with their working conditions, because you have this giant number of people standing in line for a job, and you can mistreat them all you want. There's going to be 10 more people there to take their place. So on the good side of it, you do have an increased standard of living for many, like running water inside their building, that kind of thing. But not for all. Some people, just to have that running water made them feel like they were living in a palace. But not for all people. If you can put up with the crowded streets like you see here in the upper left-hand corner, it's just suddenly overnight these people that lived in these wide open spaces are thrown together in these tiny spaces where there's constant sound. And because of that and many other reasons, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, that constant noise and living by the clock for the first time and never having any privacy actually excels the suicide rate in city dwellers. A suicide rate just skyrockets. And sociologists of the time, which was a new idea of the time, sociology and studying human groups and individuals, realized that it was city life. These farmers coming in out of the fields and being thrown together in mass numbers, their psyche just couldn't take it. You do also have a growth of the middle class, which means you're going to have lots of new businesses open, because a middle class usually has people that can spend money on frivolous things. So you're going to have theaters open, any kind of entertainment that you can think of. Sports will grow because people can buy tickets to the sporting events, that kind of thing. So the growth of middle classes also changes the face of America, because now people are going to be looking for entertainment. Here's just another picture of what it was like in one of these towns. So again, you have horse and buggies everywhere, you have people everywhere, and this is 24/7. They had already gotten rid of that idea that Sunday was a day of rest, and it was just another day to sell goods. This was a very common scene across the world in modernizing cities. People did not have anywhere to do their laundry, and so they would run them out on these little wheel type contraptions where they could run it between buildings, and you would do it early in the morning, and you had a certain day that you were allowed to use the clothesline because you shared it with other families in buildings across the way from you. But you would hang your laundry out early in the morning, and the cities were so filthy that by the end of the day, when you pulled your laundry back in, your dried laundry, it was already covered in soot. So kind of, at least I guess it didn't smell like body odor, but it was still definitely covered in soot. We talked about those all-weather roads and how it was great for trade, but how did it affect the families that actually lived in the cities? It did make travel easier for them as well, but it also created this environment where people used to just pee in the street. I mean, it was a common thing to see people just basically pee in the street. They didn't really have time to put the sewer systems together either. So a lot of the sewer systems in these bathrooms, and if there was a bathroom inside your apartment, the sewage just ran right down into the street. And because of that, because of the all-weather roads, there was no place for the urine and the feces to settle into. It just kind of floated on the streets. And when it did rain, God help you if you lived at the bottom of a hill, because all that human waste was going to end up at your doorstep and flood your house. So it was like a water slide, basically. You had to choose wisely where you were going to live in a city. It also created a problem no one foresaw. This is a time period of horse and buggies still. What do you do with a dead horse in a city environment? Because everything has been stoned over. There's no place to go bury a horse. So basically people would drag their dead horse out into the middle of the street in the middle of the night and leave it there. And you have all these little children that are now living in the cities. Mommy and daddy have to work day and night. There's no such thing as daycare. The kids fend for themselves. You can see how little some of these kids are. And here's a dead horse in the middle of July. And if you look at it close enough, you can see that its belly looks like it's moving inside. And what little boy or girl could walk away from that? You're going to find a stick like the boy in the picture, and you're going to poke its belly. And its belly is actually boiling from the heat. And when you poke a boiling belly, it's going to explode all over the kids, and now the kids are sick. And now you have horse guts also washing down the side of the street. Just not a very healthy environment at all. And people just didn't foresee that. Now, people had to have a place to live. So builders were given this assignment to figure out a way to make buildings that could fit lots and lots of people and go up very, very quickly. So they created two separate designs. I'm going to tell you about another one that's not pictured here first. It's called a dumbbell design, and basically it was a bunch of apartments on top of each other, and in the very center of the building you would have this bell-shaped hollowed out funnel basically. And in every single apartment, you had this giant open hole that led into this funnel system. And then you would open the windows as well throughout the building, and it was supposed to create this air vent. So it seemed like a really good idea, but the people who built it didn't really take didn't really consider that human beings are kind of disgusting. And so think of some place like Chicago, and it's January, and you're in one of these teeny tiny rooms. Your family's room is probably a 10 by 10, maybe 11 by 12 if you have a little bit more money, and there could be as many as 8 to 12 to 15 of you living in this little teeny tiny room. It's the middle of the night in January in Chicago. You're in the far corner away from the door to get out. You got one of the apartments that doesn't even have a window. All you have is that giant hole that leads to the shaft, that funnel for the air vent. So if you have to pee, and the only place to pee is outside down 3 flights of stairs, and you have to step over all these people to get to it, what are you going to do? You're going to pee in the hole. People ended up throwing dead animals down there, scraps of food that they didn't want, dirty everything that you can think of, dumping a child's dirty diaper down the hole. And the builders never thought about creating a way, an access vent, to clean the vent out. So it just kept piling up and piling up and piling up, and people got sick. It smelled horrible. Dead animals and everything else in one spot. Yeah, not a great idea. So the second version that came along of the dumbbell system, you can see here in front of you on the screen. And they named it the dumbbell this time. The first one was shaped like a bell that didn't ring, so it was dumb as in silent, the dumbbell. But here it's actually dumbbells like the dumbbells that you go to the gym and you lift. So it's 2 dumbbells side by side, and this is a brand new design. They don't have the shaft down the middle anymore. They now have a courtyard. And there are windows that face the courtyard. And there are tiny windows that face the street. It's supposed to give you privacy, but it also creates an air vent. So they thought this would be a better idea. But same problem. You have this teeny tiny little room. It's in the middle of the night. You don't have indoor plumbing. You have to go outside to pee. You don't want to go all the way outside to pee. So you pee in the most convenient window, which led to the courtyard. Well, people wanted a safe place to put their children, and guess what? The courtyard kind of made like a giant playpen for all the children. So at night, everybody peed into the courtyard, and during the day, all the children played in the courtyard. Not too healthy, but that's the way that it worked out. So living in a tenement building was not the best life you can think of. Here's an average tenement room, and again, you could have as many as 10, 15 people living in this one room. So you have a bed. It does not have a mattress on it because mattresses were flammable. A lot of them did not have a mattress. They just laid down heavy blankets. You have a stove right there in the same room, right beside the bed. You have one trunk to basically put in everything that you own. There was no room to do anything. This is their home. This is their kitchen, their living room, their bathroom. One of the pot that you see closest to the woman probably was a pea pot. They eventually started doing it that way, and then you would dump it out the window when it got full. Yeah, not a great environment. I can smell it from here. This is one that was probably they had these little rooms that were for single men, and you could allow as many men as you wanted to live there. It wasn't families; it was all single working men, and you just shared the rent. But you could go to the bulletin board on the outside of the apartment building and see if there was a single male position or placement open in the building, and you could join. So I know it's hard to see, but there are 12 men in this picture, all bundled up, not a lot of heat. You can see that they had to use the stove to pile stuff up on rather than to light it. So they're probably half freezing to death, but they're all bundled up there, all those guys together. So that's the single guy room. The bachelor pad. Great, huh? Often you would have to actually put your children outside on the fire escape because there just was not enough room for them. Sometimes that happened in the winter. It always happened in the summer because it was a way to keep the kids cool and to make more room for the adults inside. And two, this was basically the only way that the adults ever had any privacy, so they could make even more children to put out on the fire escape. But there's lots of kids in this picture too. You can see the feet coming in from both directions. They usually did have lots of animals for the kids to sleep with during the winter, so it would help to keep them warm. You can see how dirty the children are in the picture. And not only did you have to worry about the kids being out here on the fire escape and being too many and maybe being pushed off the edge. Children got killed that way quite often, but fire escapes also fell because there was too many kids on the fire escape and it couldn't hold the weight, so you lost children that way as well. It was a very dangerous thing to do, but sometimes you just didn't have a choice. All right, the factory itself led to lots of problems in the factories and outside. So you have people living in the tenements, crammed together, not a great life. But what about their work life? What are they doing every day when they're not at home? Well, they're competing in that workforce. And suddenly men are faced with this new thing where women and children are their competition for wages. Women and children are willing to work cheaper. They are willing to work longer hours. Kids don't argue with you. Women and children can fit into smaller places. Their fingers are better for doing intricate things like the weaving and working in the textile machines. So men actually were kind of put at the back of the line for hiring for a lot of jobs. That's also going to increase the suicide rate because for the first time, these men aren't first on the list. And, men have always been treated as the mainstay of the workforce, but not anymore. So it's going to change their way of looking at themselves, and that increases the suicide rate among the males in society. The big thing with child labor is that it kept cost of production really low because kids sometimes worked for nothing but food, but the profits were really high. So you can see some of the things that the children had to do. They often came to work barefoot, were told to, because they could climb the machines easier. They could climb in the machines. There's no liability during this period. So if a textile machine clogs up and a child is sent into the guts of the machine to unclog it, and the machine accidentally turns on and kills them or chops off a finger or a toe, there's no worries for the factory owner. There's no liability there. So child labor, the kids were treated like slaves. Some of them were actually adopted by the owners of the factory and treated as slaves. They were tied to the machines, chained to them. They were paid in nothing but food and water, and they worked 20 hours a day and slept by the machine. Their life was that machine, and they knew it inside and out and how to take care of it. And there was nobody in the beginning that was willing to speak up for these kids because you have such a massive amount of people moving into the cities at the same time, and they all need jobs. And if you're the guy speaking out against the system, you're not going to have a job. So in the beginning, these poor kids were kind of left to whatever the factory owner asked them to do, and they just didn't argue with it. So these are women, of course, working in the textiles. And again, they had those smaller fingers, they could unclog the machines, but they came up with a very unique thing during this time period that factory owners actually created dormitories for young women. And in those dormitories, a woman would come, she could have schooling after hours, she would be provided with food and a place to sleep and a small wage, and the wage would actually go to her family. So think about the time period where people are economically disadvantaged all over the place, and you have a very small farm and you have sons and daughters. The sons can help you in the field, but you only need so many daughters. So if a factory owner came to you and said, hey, I have a job for your daughter, she can move into the city where she can look for a good husband, she won't be a burden to you anymore because we're going to feed her and we're actually going to send money back to you, that sounds like a great idea. So basically these girls were hired to be a factory worker while they waited for a husband to come along and take care of them. So at 14, 15, 16 years old, they're taken away from their families, they're put into these dorms, which in the beginning were actually kind of nice. But most of these women worked in cotton textiles. And cotton is, oh my goodness, cotton has lots of things that can affect your health. If you ever walked into a cotton factory during this time period, you would see these little floaty things all over the place. And those little floaty things were actually shards, very sharp shards of cotton. And they didn't realize that if you breathe that stuff in, it's going to hurt you. So a year or two in the factory, your lungs are just filled with this, filled with cotton basically, and so now you have breathing problems. As a young woman, you know, you're not even 20, you already can't catch your breath. Also, the women spent lots and lots of hours, as you can see in the bottom picture, bent over these machines, fixing them, adjusting them, unclogging them, and hour after hour of bending over creates a stoop in your back. So now you have a young girl who came in there perfectly healthy, who can't breathe right anymore, and she's hunchbacked, and the cotton shards actually embedded themselves in the girl's skin and absorbed all the oils out of their faces and aged them tremendously. So here these poor young girls come to find a husband, but a couple years after they're there, they can't breathe, they sound like a heavy smoker, they can't stand up straight, and now they look really old. Don't think they're going to get a husband, right? So it started out as a good idea, but it ended up being a very bad thing for the young girls that actually worked there. The mining companies didn't fare any better with as far as their employees were concerned. Owners of the mines and the factories, but we're going to talk about mines, they had considerable control over the lives of their laborers because they basically usually owned the town that the people were working in. Now the miners especially, these coal mining towns in America and in Europe were owned usually by an individual, and they owned all the houses there, they owned all the tools, they owned the mine. You had to rent everything from them, and your pay was not really pay, it was on paper. And they had a country store or a company store that you would go to get your supplies like blankets, food, oil, coal, whatever you needed to survive and for your family to survive. And everything that you purchased from the company store came off of your paycheck at the end of the month. And at the end of the month, if you didn't have anything left, then you were in debt to the company. At the end of the month, if you did have something left over, it was only on paper at that company store. You didn't actually ever have cash in your hand. So it would roll over to the next month, whatever they still owed you, and you might be able to buy an extra blanket, but you never had cash. You never had actual cash. So for you to be able to get out of that town, you can't. You owed them for everything. You even had to pay for your own coal, even though you were mining it yourself. You definitely were not allowed to take anything home with you. Every little thing that you can think of that you needed to survive, you had to buy from the factory owner or especially the mine owner. The mines were very discriminatory as well. When immigration became a big thing, especially here in America, when you have so many different ethnic groups coming together, at the company store, they would actually have a list of all the different nationalities and ethnic groups, and they would list right there out in the open what your rent would be, how much you would pay for your electric bill, how much you were going to get paid, and it was different for everybody. The Italians and the Poles and the Slav people were paid much, much less than anybody else. The Italians were considered mean, so, we're doing you a favor putting you in the mines. The Poles already had that reputation of not being very smart. Not sure where that reputation comes from, so let's put them in the ground with a very low paying job. And the Slavic people had gotten this reputation of being unclean. So these are three groups that nobody else wanted to work with, so they were paid the least. They were even paid less than Irish. So it was very dependent on where you came from, and these people from all different walks of life and all different nationalities came together in these coal towns and had to do the bidding of the coal owners. There were lots of different jobs for children as well. These little children and women are coal sorters. So they're actually going through the bins and throwing out what's good and throwing out what's bad and keeping what's good. These little boys are called anthracite breakers. And again, they're breaking the usable coal away from what is not usable. And anthracite, if you don't know this, actually causes cancer. The little particles that are emitted when you break it actually causes cancer. So most of these kids got some form of cancer later in their life and died because of it. But you were a slave to the system, and if you were an anthracite breaker as a child and you survived, then you were just going to be thrown into the mines as an adult. So kids didn't tend to complain. You could work them long hours and tell them if you don't work, you're not going to eat, and they would keep on working. So children were used a lot in the mines. They could go into very small spaces. They weren't afraid, hadn't developed that fear yet of being in cramped spaces. As long as you gave them a light, they were fine. And some of them even saw it as an adventure to go into these holes and play discoverer. So these poor little children were basically chained to the coal mine. Whatever little life that they had, they were chained there for their whole lives. Now, there were other social effects that were actually good effects. Great Britain is going to outlaw slavery. They felt like this huge demand that they had put on Southern America to give them cotton, they realized that it increased that need for slavery, and it changed the face of slavery in America. They realized that, and I guess it was their way of kind of compensating for their guilt for expanding slavery in America. So in Great Britain, they outlawed it. Because of the Industrial Revolution. They also expanded education. Now, Industrial Revolution is not going to, the owners of all these industries aren't doing it out of the kindness of their heart, but they came to realize very quickly, if we teach people to read, we don't have to train them. We can just put a sign up at every machine saying, this is what you need to do, tell them to read the sign and walk away. So it's actually going to save us money on training. But it worked out good for the people in the end because they were getting educated for the very first time. So let's talk about some of the social effects of the Industrial Revolution. So women and children are entering the workplace. We've already talked about that. Women for the first time are feeling independent. Men for the first time are feeling threatened. And children for the first time are really being used and abused by the factory owners. So all their lives are changing. Because of women being in the workforce, the introduction of reforms to end child labor is going to start. Men were the ones that, again, I told you, they were kind of put in the back. We don't need as many men as we do children and women. Men complain. Men have demands that women and children don't. They're bigger. They can't fit into the machines. So men felt like they had to really watch what they had to say. Women did too, but not as much. So women were the ones that actually started to talk out against what was happening to the kids in these factories. They saw what was happening to it, and they decided that the only way to make a real change was to get the right to vote. So allowing women in got somebody to say, hey, we're treating kids wrong, which led to the idea that women should be allowed to have the vote. So it's a domino effect, just like most of history. Now, the introduction of this idea of change led to people like Upton Sinclair writing his book, The Jungle, which is all about the meatpacking industry. And Upton Sinclair is what we call a muck raker, because he was raking up muck or dirt on all these different industries and sharing his findings with the public. So Upton Sinclair is not the only one, but Upton Sinclair, in his writing The Jungle, really got the attention of Teddy Roosevelt. And because of that one book, we now have the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, that has all these laws about meat products and, you know, what you're allowed to sell to people and all the rules about that. How long can you have it sitting on the shelf? All of that. So Upton Sinclair started, you know, working on reform for better working conditions, and it ended up that he exposed this meat industry and how we were all eating rotten meat. So all of these things, again, a domino effect. The natural course of events is going to end up having labor unions evolve out of all these things that are happening in the factories, and women and then men eventually joining in and saying, we're not going to stand for this anymore. And these labor unions are groups of people that came together under a common cause, and they encouraged worker organized strikes. And most often, the strikes were to get increased wages and improved working conditions. Those were the two big things. Again, one more time, increased wages and improved working conditions for everybody, men, women, and children. And they lobbied for laws to improve the lives of workers, including the women and the children specifically. There were laws that said that children could only work so many hours a day. And again, that's mostly women doing that, lobbying for actual legislature to be developed that outlaws certain things. That was the women that did that. And then again, you have these workers that want the right to have a voice. And what it started out with originally when unions first came about is you would have a union representative for each factory that would go and talk to the owners of the factory by themselves, basically as a representative of everybody that worked there. The problem with that is you as a worker don't know what goes on between that representative and the owners when they're in that closed door meeting. So your representative might be going in there gung-ho saying, you know, I'm gonna kick somebody's butt and I'm gonna get us all these rights and privileges, and he's really walking in there going, please don't fire me, what do you want me to do? So they ended up doing something called collective bargaining, where everybody, all of labor and all of management, are brought together in one large meeting where everyone's voice can be heard, and everything that goes on is open common knowledge to everyone. So no more closed door meetings. And that actually was made a law that you had to allow your workers the action of collective bargaining when they were demanding change. So again, we have even all this change is going to accelerate that idea of colonialism, because you need more and more places to get goods. You need more and more places to get people who will build things for you and who will buy things from you. So industrialization actually accelerates colonialism. So keep that in mind. All right, so how does all of this end up to a point where people start doubting the political entity that is controlling their country? All of these things, all of these changes that we've talked about from the first day of class up until now is going to culminate into this idea of what type of government should we have, because you have these governments from all these big countries going to these colonies and changing their government, and new governments are going to evolve out of it. So you have these new things called capitalism, socialism, and then out of socialism we get communism. So let's look at how these things came to be and what they each are. Now, capitalism was first coined by a man named Adam Smith, and he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. Now, capitalism is an economic system that is based on private ownership private ownership, so an individual can own it, private ownership and investment of money in order to make a profit. So by this, businesses would run by market competition. You have to have competition. You have to make sure that competition is not impeded. And we have all kinds of laws set in place in America about that. You have to allow people the access to entrepreneurial abilities. So if I want to donate money to a company to help them succeed, I'm allowed to. And there should be nothing to impede it. So that's why certain companies, if they are considered a monopoly, kind of like Walmart, if you ask me, where they're the holding company for a certain product, the government will step in and break them up and say you're not allowing enough competition. That happened with AT&T years and years ago, that they were considered too powerful. The government felt like they were so large that individuals, consumers were not they had no choice in telephone companies. So AT&T was forced to separate into several different entities by government force. Now that doesn't happen very often in America, but that was impeding a chance for other people to make a profit. And it was getting rid of that idea of competition, and you can't have that in capitalism. So based on that definition, of course, we are a capitalist nation. All right, so think about here in the United States. These are all questions that you are allowed to ask yourself in the United States. What kind of property do you want to own? Where do you want to invest money, or do you? Do you want to start a business? Do we have market competition? Absolutely. All of those things are things that are all about the United States. So capitalism basically says the sky is the limit. You can own this car, you can own this house, you can own a chain of some of these places, or become an investor in them and make money off of their stock. The sky is the limit. You are allowed to do what you want to do with your money as long as it's within the legal system, right? Some people say that capitalism is not fair because it leads to this unequal distribution of wealth. So you have this guy over here on the left-hand side who is homeless and has nothing, and then you have Oprah Winfrey, who basically could buy the world if she wanted to. And then you have this group in the middle, the disappearing group, the middle class group, who is so far removed from the groups on either side of them that they're not even comparable. So you have this giant gap between the poorest of the poor, the richest of the rich, and everybody in between. So if you don't know it, this is what it's come to in America right now. The top 1% holds 40% of all the wealth in our nation. So 1% of the people in the United States has 40% of our wealth. Gates, actually, Bill Gates is the first centibillionaire in America. That word was made up for him. You don't have to know that. I just think that's interesting. And Oprah's annual salary right now is at $575 million a year. So I can't tell you if that's fair or not. I mean, is capitalism fair? I can't tell you. You have to make up your own mind on that. But if you will click on the video, it may help you decide. So check that video out, and I'll see you on the next slide. Let's take a look at socialism. Socialism and communism are very closely related. Socialism actually comes first. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels are the one that kind of change it just a little bit to create something called communism. And communism and socialism both say that you should not have this market competition because it leads to this inequality, that wealth should be redistributed so that everybody is equal. And in socialism and communism, you're not born to be a doctor, or a lawyer because you're going to make lots of money at it. You're not going to be an actress or an athlete and make millions. You're just not. Everything is equal, and they think that is the way that it should be. So who's to say which is right, correct? Now, the impact of Marxism, which is that evolving from socialism into communism, does inspire several revolutionaries that you may know: Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, in communism. But I do want you to keep in mind that socialism and communism themselves are not evil. They are simply ideologies. The idea of taking a country who is desperately poor, and 99% of the people living there are dying of starvation, and you have 1% who is living the high life, drinking champagne 3 meals a day, and buying planes and everything else. That may be a kind of country that you need to go to and say, let's level the playing field. And communism and socialism were both meant to be temporary, so that it would level the playing field, and then they could evolve into something else where people could have goals and dreams. It just has never been done the way that Marx actually suggested that it be done. And all these people that you see in front of you on the screen went to the extremes. The power got to them, and they became totalitarian dictators on the evil side. So I don't want you to think that socialism or communism are evil. They're just ideologies. They're just a way of setting up a political and economic system. It's the men who have used it that have done bad things with it, not the ideology itself. So let's see the difference here between socialism and communism. It's actually pretty simple. Socialism is based on deed, and communism is based on need. So here's the deal. Socialism allows a little bit of a class difference. Communism, as you can see, is classless. Everybody is equal. In socialism, if you are this mastermind or this super scientific stud that can cure cancer, or you are the best athlete on the planet, you are allowed to rise above the others and be treated differently and live a little bit better and have your claim to fame. But those people are very few and far between. So you can't say socialism is classless. It is nearly, but not totally classless. Communism is, and that is the big difference between the two. All right, so that is the end of the Industrial Revolution. I know it took a while, but so much to talk about in one unit, and see you next time.